Today, our message is entitled Weakness to Strength. We're focusing on Paul's letter to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 6, verses 1 through 13. We love to focus on strength, don't we? Whether we're watching movies about superheroes or people who do incredible tasks or even the super intelligent or innovative people, we love those who operate out of a position of strength. Of course, that seems natural enough. Who doesn't want to be strong? Who doesn't want to be at the top of their game? I don't think any one of us really likes to look at our lives and see ourselves as being less than. And yet, so often in our lives, that's exactly how we look at ourselves. We wonder what we could have done if we had just made a different choice or gone down a different path at a critical juncture in our lives. Sometimes I think when we get to those places in our lives, we are far more like the ancient Corinthians than we would like to believe. We judge our life based on superficial and transitory things, and so often we judge ourselves in comparison with other people. We set the wrong measuring points, and then we're critical of ourselves for not reaching them. Then, at the same time, we look at the good measuring points, and we devalue them. We see them as less important than they actually are. We're going to see in our text today Paul measuring his life correctly, how he sets himself against the expectations and evaluations of others. Before we get to that, though, let's read the text. As God's partners, we beg you not to accept this marvelous gift of God's kindness and then ignore it. For God says, "At just the right time I heard you. On the day of salvation I helped you. Indeed, the right time is now. Today is the day of salvation." We live in such a way that no one will stumble because of us, and no one will find fault with our ministry. In everything we do, we show that we are true ministers of God. We patiently endure troubles and hardships and calamities of every kind. We have been beaten, been put in prison, faced angry mobs, worked to exhaustion, endured sleepless nights, and gone without food. We prove ourselves by our purity, our understanding, our patience, our kindness, by the Holy Spirit within us, and by our sincere love. We faithfully preach the truth. God's power is working in us. We use the weapons of righteousness in the right hand for attack and the left hand for defense. We serve God whether people honor us or despise us, whether they slander us or praise us. We are honest, but they call us impostors. We are ignored even though we are well known. We live close to death, but we are still alive. We have been beaten, but we have not been killed. Our hearts ache, but we always have joy. We are poor, but we give spiritual riches to others. We own nothing, and yet we have everything. Oh, dear Corinthian friends, we have spoken honestly with you, and our hearts are open to you. There is no lack of love on our part, but you have withheld your love from us. I am asking you to respond as if you were my own children. Open your hearts to us. I think the first thing we can learn from this text is the importance about being honest about weakness. We all have weaknesses, and they hit us hard at times and in different moments in our lives. I think the greatest lie that we are ever told is that if we share our weakness or show our weakness and struggles with others, that we'll be rejected or seen as a burden or something like that. And so we suffer alone, beating ourselves up as less than others, and even thinking we are a disappointment to God. The same God, of course, the Bible tells us, loved the world so much he sent his Son into this mess that we live in order to save us. We need to learn from Paul in this letter how to better understand life and ourselves in light of this good news of Jesus Christ. We know from the first letter of Corinthians that the church was kind of focused on everything being good and going well and experiencing this kind of blessing and spiritual blessings of God and the connection between the two. And Paul had to correct them about many of their theological ideas. It's an easy move for us to understand how the Corinthians thought because we have people with a similar theology even in the modern world. People who connect God's blessing as having a good job and having a nice house and having good health and maybe financial security. But what happens when a person does not have a good job or a nice house, or their health is failing, or they're suffering financially? For people who have a blessing as worldly success theology, God's clearly not on their side. Or they see that God has somehow removed his blessing from their lives. But Paul doesn't equate, things going well in life with God's blessing. He takes what the Corinthians would interpret as a lack of blessing, and he uses that to show how faithful he is to the mission that God has given to him. Paul uses these things to show how God's power is at work, even when things looked to the Corinthians like weakness or the lack of blessing. Paul wants to show them that they are looking at things all wrong, that they need to have a more profoundly spiritual vision of life and what's going on. You see, the Corinthian Christians rooted their faith in circumstances instead of rooting their circumstances in light of their faith. In other words, they had, labeled the wrong thing unshakable in their lives. For them, it was circumstances, and from those circumstances, they could determine whether God's blessing was on you. But for Paul, the unshakable thing was God's declaration that the right time is now. Today is the day of salvation. For Paul, God was on the move, and Jesus Christ had called Paul to join him on the Damascus road, and Paul had said yes. Just look at how Paul makes his list. He says that he and his co-workers have demonstrated that they were true ministers of God. And then he issues a list that seems to go on forever. He uses the word in plus another word 18 times in this passage to make his point. Almost all English translation changed the way Paul lists these things because I suppose they felt it made terrible English. And I suppose in any language it would be terrible, but that should maybe cue us into the fact that Paul, who was educated and articulate, used the length of this monotonous list to make a point. He was driving that point home to the Corinthians. I made up a slide to illustrate this, just so you can see. Now, the Greek's on there just for a reference point, because I wanted you to see the incredible list that Paul makes. How he just hammers home this idea. In endurance, in afflictions, in calamity, in troubles, in beatings, in prisons. Is this list going to stop? No. In riots, in toil, in sleeplessness. Okay, Paul, we get the point. You can move on now. No, he's not done. In hunger. But notice the transition. This word also means fasting, and that flips us over into a whole different set of characteristics. In purity, in knowledge, in perseverance, in kindness, in the Holy Spirit, in sincere love, in truthful words, in the power of God. You see, at the heart of this, Paul is explaining to the church that they need to look differently at the world and their circumstances than the culture around them. How easy it is for us to fall into this Corinthian trap. The lectionary readings today include 1 Samuel 17, the story of David and Goliath. And, it's a story of victory, but in the story, David makes it very clear that it's the Lord who is the victor. It's the Lord who is the primary actor. Almost every David and Goliath meme that we see today make it all about the little guy against the big guy. But the true winner in this story is infinitely bigger than the world's greatest giants. The primary actor in the story is God. Likewise, in the lectionary, the gospel reading from Mark 4, it shows Jesus rebuking the storm and calming the sea. And again, it's a story of power and victory, but it's the Lord's power and it's the Lord's victory. The disciples had to wake Jesus up because they were afraid, and they asked this question. They say, "Don't you care that we're about to drown?" in verse 38. Jesus did care, of course, and he knew that they were not going to drown, but in order to help them believe, he calmed the storm. The disciples, you see, were just as safe 5 minutes before the miracle as they were 5 minutes after. But they needed faith to see that reality. And most of us struggle to see God's power in the midst of human weakness. The weakness that Paul sees is not an apparent lack of blessing, but it's basically the lack of faith on the part of the Corinthian church, a lack of vision, a lack of being able to see. Paul moves us away from this idea of weakness to the idea of God's power at work in us. He says to the Corinthians, "Oh, dear Corinthians, we have spoken honestly with you, and our hearts are open to you." His heart was open, and his words were honest. And all he wants from the Corinthians is for them to open their hearts as well, and to experience the true power of God at work in their lives. When we experience the power of God at work in us, we will find strength to press on. And as Paul says, we patiently endure in verse 4. The endurance that Paul speaks about is the result of the same faith that David had when he said in that passage of Samuel to Goliath, "You come with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." I think we all have had to learn some hard lessons over the last year about endurance. Some have pressed on and others have not. Some have decided to take a break and some have decided to give up altogether. It's hard to know what the future holds, but it's always been that way. The fact has always been that the things that make us confident and strong today can at any moment crumble under our feet tomorrow. It took a pandemic to demonstrate this to the world, but the reality has always been that health and security have always been a fragile foundation upon which to build a life. Saul wanted David to put on his armor and to use his sword because, that's just the way things are done, right? It was David knew that he wasn't going to beat Goliath with weapons or cunning. The only way he'd be able to defeat that giant was if God defeated the giant for him and through him. Not only will we find strength to endure, but we will also find strength not to make excuses. Paul writes, "We serve God whether people honor us or despise us." It's okay to have weakness, to be afraid. It's okay to have doubts. It would have been fine if that were the only problem in the Corinthian church, but it wasn't. The problem was also the fact that of their pride and their confidence in believing the wrong thing, having a worldly point of view. And we know that they struggled with this worldly point of view because, as we saw last week in 2 Corinthians 5, Paul challenged them not to see things from a human point of view. And the word that's used there is fleshly. It means a human perspective in this context, but it also, with Paul, has a connotation of being unspiritual, or in some places even sinful. For Paul, whether he was being honored or dishonored by the people around him, his service to God remained the same. He had the insight to see God at work. Even in storms and riots and beatings and in prison, Paul still saw God working. He saw God working through the gospel, changing people's lives and setting people free. But also he himself experienced God at work in having the strength to be gentle and to remain pure and to experience the power of the Holy Spirit in his life. And of course, the most important fruit of the Holy Spirit, sincere love. And so my final observation is this: we will find strength to open our hearts. Paul says there is no lack of love on our part, but you have withheld your love from us. Open your hearts to us, he says. Despite the opposition Paul and his co-workers experienced from the Corinthian church, despite the misunderstandings and miscommunications, it did not have an effect on Paul's sincere love for the Corinthians. Paul still spoke the truth to them, and he opened his heart to them. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't unforgiving. His was not a love that only showed up when things were going his way. His love was sincere. Jesus Christ had changed Paul's point of view, and he didn't see life in terms of off and on, or right or left, or up and down. For Paul, whether it was shipwreck or gentleness, it was God at work. Whether it was prison or spiritual insight, it was God at work. In honor or dishonor, in slander or praise, one way or the other, Paul saw it as an opportunity for God to work. As we seek to move forward after a devastating year, as we seek to be faithful to God, we need to follow Paul's example and to forgive each other when we failed one another or disappointed each other. Each of our lives has been touched in ways that have the means to injure us, but instead let us see with a different perspective. Let's see with the eyes of faith. Let's open our hearts to each other and love one another. Let us move from our weakness to God's strength and experience afresh God's power at work in us. Relevant, practical, authentic. River of Life.